What is the purpose of art? Friedrich Schiller said, "Art should remain play, but also be poetic play. Art is dedicated to joy, and there is no higher and more serious task than of making people happy. The highest enjoyment, however, is the freedom of the inner life of feeling in the living play of all its powers." So how have we arrived at the present, where our artistic culture, from Hollywood movies to pop music to the visual arts, seems to be an orgy of decadence, nihilism, and violence?
Kyle, can we start by having you trace this historical arc?
Starting with Schiller and that period of, it's called Weimar Classicism, or sort of that period in Germany of the late 1700s and early to mid 1800s, is typified by that attitude that is expressed in the Schiller quote. And I think you can trace a path from there to Hitler and then back to the modern art movement in the US and Western Europe, starting really with Beatlemania and like abstract expressionism and all of this kind of stuff. The period that is the most interesting to me is this thing called the Vienna Secession. And you get the Wittgenstein family, and that's, people might be familiar with Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's this, he's a philosopher and a logician. He's around in the 20s. He's sort of in the same circle as people like Bertrand Russell. Wittgenstein's father, Karl, was, I wouldn't call him an oligarch. He was basically an industrial capitalist. He was the lead producer of steel in Germany at this time. Actually, it would have been the Austro-Hungarian Empire in like the 1870s and 80s. And that is coming out of this time when what was happening in America in the 1860s was picked up in Germany and Russia in the following decades. And you had this explosion of industry. And Karl Wittgenstein was actually a pretty interesting character who was out promoting the American system and telling German labor leagues and political groups and anyone who would listen that Germany needs to be adopting protective tariffs. They need to be putting credit into the steel industry, and basically that they need to protect themselves from the product dumping of Great Britain. This family, one of his sons is Ludwig Wittgenstein. The other three sons all commit suicide, and it's a very troubled family. And I think it could be said that basically the father then pins all of his hopes on Ludwig, who is kind of a degenerate artist. And so all of the money of this empire, which is passed on to the younger Wittgenstein, goes into this thing called the Vienna Secession.
Was that to support the aspirations of Ludwig?
Not even his own aspirations so much as a circle of people around him. Like, the family were intimates of people like Brahms, who was sort of a classical musician. But Ludwig gets involved with people like Gustav Klimt. His famous painting is called The Kiss. He has these like gold emblazoned paintings of sort of semi-abstract figures. You know, Klimt was sort of like a classical painter turned modernist painter, and his stuff is not that wild, but it starts to get these secessionists start to get pretty wild. Like people like Egon Schiele, people might be familiar with it, where it goes from being sort of pushing the boundaries into just overt pornography, like in a short period of time. And it's the same thing happens with music.
What was an example of the art before Egon Schiele and these guys came along? What could we visualize?
Basically, like neo-Renaissance kind of stuff. You could look at, like, the best traditions of the German painters would be, even like the guy who painted Washington crossing the Delaware was a German. Or Bierstadt, who was like a landscape painter who came over and painted the Yosemite Valley as sort of a way of propagandizing this idea of developing the West and creating rail lines out to the West. So realism with a purpose into starting to become just all about formalism and just degenerate into pornography. It's the same thing in music where, like I said, you start with Brahms and then you get into Gustav Mahler and Arnold Schoenberg and the people like this that it just starts to become atonal and dissonant. Much less and less pleasant to listen to as time goes on. But it is part of, I think, a historical process where it unravels, and at sort of the apex of this degeneration comes the First World War, and that's what plunges Germany into just cultural despair, I think you could say, where there's nothing left of the culture of Schiller, and it's the culture of, the Versailles reparations and just mass death and mass poverty and the economy coming apart. So that's step one. And so out of that, you can see that the Nazis come in as a reaction to this kind of cultural decay. And rather than blaming the problems of Germany on the British, basically, they're coming in and blaming it in part on things like, when the Nazis come into power, they sort of create this whole classification of degenerate art and degenerate music. A lot of the painters and composers were Jewish, and they'll sort of apply this label of degeneracy to people. Like, I think it even became illegal to perform or to listen to people like Mahler and Schoenberg. And
later in the show, we will get into how possibly our country is on the precipice of this, and how fascist candidates are coming into office as a reaction to the decadence in America.
I think we've talked before in the show about this thing called moral rearmament, which was in the United States, but it's a similar kind of a thing where the Nazis come in, and instead of saying, hey, these guys took our culture away, let's go back to the culture that they took from us, it's basically like blame everything on the degeneration of culture A, but then go all the way back in time to culture B. And they sort of create this neo-pagan, almost like Greco-Roman style that just gets really awful. One thing that's kind of an interesting parallel is Schiller's got his Ode to Joy. That's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is based on the Schiller poem. And then the Nazis, they have like a compulsory recreation program that's called Strength Through Joy. And basically they are like loading Germans onto trains and buses and taking them to like compulsory camps to do these sort of like quote unquote traditional dances and listening to the right kind of composers, which are these, which is stuff like Wagner. And there is a tourist resort that was part of this program that was never completed called Prora. It's like the architectural equivalent of the swastika. It's just like a huge monolith set right there on this nice oceanfront property. It's sort of an interesting counterpoint to what you were saying, where Schiller's talking about poetic play and dedicating art to joy. It goes from that into just absolute pornography and decadence, and then all the way back to just this severe, brutal, lifeless, overpowering type of art. I think you get that to some degree in the Soviet Union also. It's hard to even think of a parallel because we don't have the same system of government, but it would be as if the Tea Party took power, blamed the decay of America on the moral degeneracy of Lady Gaga, and then they forced everybody to listen to country music.
If we were all forced to listen to only Faith Hill.
Yeah. Faith Hill and Ride of the Valkyries. And so then the thing that's interesting is that in the 40s and 50s, then there's this thing people may have heard of called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. There are a bunch of notables involved in that. It's people like Bertrand Russell, but it's sort of these British intelligence figures, but then it is cultural figures like they are putting money into Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock and Tennessee Williams and all of this kind of stuff that's associated with this sort of 1950s period of abstract expressionism and sort of pushing out of the New Deal culture.
That came after Rockefeller destroyed Diego Rivera's mural at Rockefeller Center.
Yeah, talk about that. That was interesting.
I was sent a book by a friend by G-Y-O-R-G-Y, Lukács, pronounced Lukács, spelled L-U-K-A-C-S. Lukács says, but the goal of all art is realism. It is the realistic portrayal of social situations, social problems, but not as sloganeering. In other words, it's the difference between our politics, what we're doing, which is actual realism. And as Lukács says again and again, you have these vulgar leftists who fill their books with slogans. That person is quantitatively inferior to even the conservative who nevertheless experiences the victory of realism. The victory of realism is this. If you are an honest and diligent student of reality, that comes down to the essence of the society you live in. How to show that through typical characters in typical situations. So you show reality, and then it's your job to show it evolving. And you can do better as a conservative with an in-depth view of society than somebody on the left who would fill up the space with slogans. Like, for instance, the left slogan is campaign finance reform, and ours is let's qualitatively reduce the power of Wall Street and its influence over the government and everything else. In my estimation, Diego Rivera was one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. There are some French Academy types before World War I, but all in all, if we take the artist and the moment and everything else, why would I say that Diego Rivera is the greatest artist of the 20th century? Because he attains a degree of realism which outdistances all the others. One of the great works is his painting in the Detroit Public Library, where he shows an assembly line. And people should look at this. We'll post a link to that photo as well on our Facebook page or on our website. And then the famous incident is when Rockefeller Center was being built in Midtown Manhattan in the 30s, the Rockefeller family, and this would have been John D. Rockefeller Jr., Diego Rivera did a mural that showed a bunch of rich mummies at a stock ticker, and John D. Rockefeller Sr. reading the tape. And these guys look like ghouls or bloodsuckers, and they represented the face of evil. So this was a tremendously powerful, realistic portrayal. Then what did the Rockefellers do with the greatest mural? They chiseled it off and they destroyed it.
Mm-hmm. And I think when you say realistic, it's important to sort of reiterate the fact that you're not talking about photorealism in terms of, like, Rivera was a good painter, but he was not the greatest painter in terms of technical skill or whatever, but he was tapping into something in the cultural zeitgeist that needed to be tapped into. He was offering a critique and offering sort of an inspiration toward a better world. And you'll probably get into this, but with the abstract expressionists, it's, you can come up with like an art school critique of Jackson Pollock, but to a real person, what could that possibly mean? Where, you know what I mean? Rivera meant something because of the time and place that was painted in, and because of the impact that being with that painting can leave on you. And that,
keep in mind, this is the same family that all the New York City climate marchers last month were so excited to have on their side. They were happy to have Rockefeller on their side. Has this been a family who's historically on your side? And are they now? People should ask themselves that seriously. One of the top 10 most expensive paintings in the world ever sold was Rothko's White Space, or later it was better known as the Rockefeller Rothko. After this Diego Rivera experience, they didn't want to have anything to do with realism ever again. And then the Rockefellers go on and found MoMA, the Modern Museum of Art. This was all a reaction to this experience with Diego Rivera, I feel, or a big part of it was.
We asked at the beginning, what is the duty of the artist? And I think that this sort of gets at that whole point. You look at this, Rothko was one of these guys funded through the Congress for Cultural Freedom. This group, the stated purpose of it was basically to counteract the cold and dead art of the Soviet Union and previously of the Nazis, and sort of like to create a new culture for the West. If you're not sure who Rothko is, you could also think of, modern psychology, if you're bringing in a lot of this stuff like the Kinsey Institute and that kind of stuff, or even, Beatlemania is kind of part of this whole thing. The Rolling Stones are part of this whole thing. You get these rich financiers like the Rockefellers or the Gettys or whoever, and they are putting their money into modern art. They're not putting their money into, like you said, restoring the murals of Diego Rivera or something like that.
Why are they, and why was it so heavily advertised and pushed in a covert way, almost like this was done as a CIA operation? It became cool. Modern art is cool. Everything else is passé. Do you know what I mean? And how did they really promoted that?
Yeah, and I think it's Wilhelm Reich calls it the society of the spectacle. it relates to things like the Situationist International, which we discussed in a previous episode. And, it's this sort of idea about we're no longer going to encourage reflection and reading and absorbing in the same way that you would have. If the people in control of society want an educated, capable workforce of people who are going to improve life for everybody and who are going to they are going to encourage art that expands the imagination, that gets you in touch with, it sounds crazy, but even with like mathematical principles through music and things like that. Whereas just sort of being part of this spectacle society or being part of the cool society, it just, I'm sure you've seen it. I definitely saw it when I was going through university art programs. You sort of have to stay a step of the head. You always have to be in the avant-garde of what is cool without any regard for like the purpose of what you're doing. It's all just it's about appearances, and it's about sort of pushing the boundaries of good taste. And
well, we're young. I never knew art to be any of this other stuff. I only thought art was supposed to be an experience.
Mm-hmm.
I heard these people describing Rothko as you're just supposed to let it wash over you. It's just an experience, and you're supposed to let it wash over you like a song. So they compared it. So you're just having a momentary experience. It's not supposed to be anything that you take with you. You're not supposed to learn anything from art. You're just supposed to feel something.
Yeah, and I mean, like, to be perfectly honest, I find Rothko's paintings to be somewhat decorative. It's like, yeah, they're okay to look at, I guess. But compare that to, like, compare Rothko's color examinations to those of, like, Claude Monet or something like that. What is more inspirational, or what is more, what is better for human beings to experience? Is it just these squares of color, or is it the guy who's really going out there and exploring like the effects of sunlight on buildings? And it's hard to talk about this without seeming like sort of like a prude or a reactionary. A good example is someone, today the big, probably the most famous visual artist is someone like Damien Hirst. The average person on the street doesn't know who this guy is, but he's the guy who's like, he just creates like a diamond encrusted skull, or he had one that was he's kind of like a shock artist where he created like a stained glass stained glass windows out of rare butterflies that he killed for the purpose of the art. It's just this awful stuff, and it sells for millions and millions of dollars.
Well, that's a good point that you brought up when you said the average person wouldn't know who Damien Hirst is. And I don't think that's the point anymore. Urban elite know who Damien Hirst is, and it's because it's a private currency for the ultra elite. It's not for public consumption anymore.
But if you're talking about art in the public sphere that like people actually encounter, I mean, again, you could talk about stuff like Lady Gaga, or if you want to look at a more overtly political message, let's look at Pussy Riot in Russia. These are supposedly artists. Oh, I haven't really seen anything resembling art that comes out of what they're doing. Or in China, they've got this guy Ai Weiwei, and it's the same kind of thing. He's not obscene or anything, but people will rush to the defense of, well, we must have freedom of artistic expression. But the expression of Pussy Riot is what? It's like, go to a grocery store and shove a frozen chicken up your lady parts, kick over an altar at a cathedral.
Well, when you start talking about people like Pussy Riot, now we've got to start talking about art as a CIA asset.
Right. In their case, the person who founded Pussy Riot is a modern art gallery owner. It's this guy named Marat Gelman. He's a Moscow-based, I think he might be a dual citizen, either Russian-Israeli or Russian-British or something like that.
So why do you think this Gelman, or what's his name? Yeah, so why do you think this Gelman then funded them?
He's not only a modern art dealer, he is one of the founders and the movers and shakers in something called the Social Democratic Party of Russia. This was founded by Gorbachev in 2001, right as Putin is gaining power. And basically they are the ones who are now pushing to reverse a lot of Putin's reforms and go back to the neoliberalism.
This is to undermine Putin.
Yeah. basically it's, you can see how there's this sort of nexus between art galleries, which, like you said, if art is a currency of the elite, then that is one of these sort of these touch points where the elite are able to congregate and are able to launder money through art, literally.
People like the Rockefellers, not to reiterate, but founding the Modern Museum of Art and the Council on Foreign Relations. What else did we see on that list that they founded?
I mean, all kinds of stuff they're involved in. If you're into conspiracy stuff, they're involved in the, like you said, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. But then in the art space, it would be like MoMA and the Japan House and if you're looking at the Rockefellers on the high level, or like today, the real big art dealers are people like Charles Saatchi or like the Getty family, or I don't know if you'd know better examples than that are more recent, but you would have to conclude based on who these people associate with, who's buying the art, that it's basically a way for hedge fund billionaires to launder their money through an underground network. This is an organized crime network. This is not art.
Yes, exactly. And it's a twofold issue. It's complicated because one is, like we were saying before, with the Stephen Cohen, who bought the Le Rêve, Picasso's dream, for $155 million from Steve Wynn. This guy made a ton of money quickly in this. His life is basically akin to that movie, The Wolf of Wall Street. He put $155 million into a single painting. Steve Cohen, this guy who was like the Wolf of Wall Street, he's also socially a nerd. People on Wall Street pay money to people in urban areas who carry social currency. A lot of these artists come in tow with bringing attractive women to the party. Wall Street guys buy these artists their drugs and buy their art from them, and this type of stuff.
In Cohen, sorry to interrupt you, but just to give another example, he is also he's being prosecuted by the SEC, but he's also undergoing a divorce from his wife, who was just some random lady that he met on like a dating site, and he stands to lose half of his wealth through a divorce to this. Just to show you that even these people who are these sort of titans of Wall Street are in every other way just complete, emotional midgets, and they can't handle basic things like that. And so art is kind of like this con game.
This guy had to be on a dating site. It's Wall Street that keeps the escort business going. All these young models are hanging out with these degenerate artists. And so the degenerate artists can con these young girls into hanging out with them. The aristocracy once had salons. I mean, look at a character like Andy Warhol. You can't get much more decadent and degenerate than that. In Manhattan snorting drugs. Then you have to also get into what could somebody like Andy Warhol and these artists understand about a third world worker. So on the one hand, it gives these guys a social life. On the other hand, it allows them to launder money. If you all of a sudden come into a few $100 million on Wall Street, are you going to put that into property, which the SEC could seize? You're always going to be insecure about your wealth, right, if it was earned that way, and if it was earned quickly. You put it into property, you can't move the property. You put it into metal, gold, it's too heavy to transport. You can roll up a painting and take it on an airplane and go anywhere in the world with it.
And the value is totally arbitrary. You can't, justify, in terms of creating, insurance policies on your assets and things like that. You can't justify overpaying for gold or diamonds or any of that other stuff that's also kind of elite currencies, but art just allows for these arbitrary valuations and these flows of money back and forth through these sort of shady networks of dealers and patrons and artists. And
well, there was that art auctioneer, that story of that art auctioneer I was telling you about that. There was a moment during the dot-com bust in the 90s, or where they were really afraid that Wall Street wasn't going to keep paying the same prices. And I forget what painting it was. I think you said it was a Van Gogh for $80 million. And it was at that time the highest priced painting at auction. And there was a standing ovation in the room. And the guy said that after 30 years of being an auctioneer, he felt sick and wanted to quit the business because this had nothing to do with art. This was all about keeping the price high so that it could be used as everything we were talking about.
Why is it that Mark Rothko in your book is not an important or a valuable artist, despite the fact that, I'm sure his defenders or people who want to get a PhD in art criticism or art history or whatever would defend him on the basis that he was somehow like an important stylistic innovator or whatever. Mm-hmm. What does that cut it for you? And if not, why not?
I can look at any piece of art and have it give me an experience. Like you said, I can enjoy a Rothko as decoration. I get exactly what the average person experiences. The light, the empty space, the color, the expansiveness. What changes for me is simple. The moment that I know that anything has an evil political agenda behind it, then it's finished for me. It becomes pornography. And then I can only see it in its political context. And people could say that the artist was just a pawn. He's not his patrons, and that we should let the artist off the hook, and I should experience it independently of its context. But for me, that doesn't cut it. That's not how I've worked. I've known too many artists who are all conscious of their patrons and the motives of their patrons. I don't believe artists are that naive. And if they are that naive, then we shouldn't be worshiping them in any way. And if you take money from the wrong people for the wrong reasons, then you're guilty by association. Just like most of the Nazi soldiers couldn't say at Nuremberg because they were just following orders. So once I know the context that a piece of art comes out of, I can't look at it anymore, or I can't hear it anymore. As soon as I started researching Russell Brand coming out of the Fabian Society, even though we thought he was a really funny guy, I stopped being able to listen to it. So for me, that's the same thing with art. The thing with me, I don't know how it is with other people, but the thing with me is that everything is political. Did you know, Kyle, that we got a message from our friend Thomas Joyce, the famous composer who has a PhD in music, in classical music, from Yale, and he sent me a song on my email right now, and I just wanted to play it for you really quickly. It's really funny.
Daniela, this is an example of modern art not funded by the Rockefellers.
Here it goes. This is called Pumice Stone.
That was awesome. Thank you to Thomas Joyce for recording that.
I asked him to compose a song about Wall Street for us. Nobody's off the hook.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, you could look at the same thing with, let's say movies where there's nothing wrong with
Sharknado,
I guess. Sharknado. Everyone loves a good Sharknado. or like, is there any harm done by Jurassic Park? Probably not. Is there room for entertainment? Is it okay to have entertainment? But then, like, what's the line? Like, if you're...
Entertainment isn't the problem. It's intelligence operations and empire debasing what's possible. I found Thomas Joyce's song uplifting, and it was modern, and it was about a pumice stone that he found on the beach today. But I can't wait for his composition on Wall Street.
Take a mundane example, like, what about these Judd Apatow movies, like Knocked Up or something like that? That seems to be kind of like the standard box office fare still these days, is these sort of like slacker comedies where it's just like a bunch of grown children smoking pot. And
it makes it funny and okay to fail at life and be a slacker. And that's not okay. You have a responsibility to make the human race better.
Right. And I think it's like you could... A lot of people would say, oh, come on, you're being prudes, it's just entertainment. But then it's just like, what does that reinforce in terms of cultural values and in terms of just what people consider to be normal or consider to be sort of like an ideal in life? You've talked it before on this show about having this romantic attachment to like beat poetry, or if you're talking about Kerouac and stuff like that. It's sort of the same thing where it's like, yeah, you can get swept up in that kind of stuff and look at Jack Kerouac as an ego ideal, and you don't really think about the fact that there was a quote, I think it was Kerouac and this Gary Snyder, who was one of his poet friends, and Snyder was trying to get him involved in anti-Vietnam War protests, and his response was something, this ended their relationship, but his response was something like, I'm fighting a war inside my mind right now.
Doesn't that just say it all?
Mm-hmm.
You know when it all changed for me? It changed as soon as I realized where this all was coming from, and then I said to myself, oh my God, you're nothing more than a CIA asset. This is the rebellion they want you to be in. This is the commercial rebellion. Then I had my first real radical change, genuine change. I went from a Madison Avenue activist to a consequential activist.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I wanted to make another point about these modern artists that circle in Greenwich Village, Jackson Pollock. The CIA often uses people that have mental disorders because they're easier to control, and people who have drug and alcohol addiction. It's easier to control somebody. It's easy to control somebody who's in the throes of addiction.
Jean-Michel Basquiat didn't stop to wonder what was the larger agenda behind popularizing his work in these elite circles. So where does the rubber meet the road in terms of, like, does this stuff influence popular culture? And I think you would have to say emphatically yes, if you're looking at, let's list a few, Jay-Z, Beyonce, Lady Gaga, this kind of stuff. I think it's really, Hollywood movies is one place, popular music is another. Here's a weird connection. I was looking some stuff up, and the year Howard Hughes died, he died a couple of months before J. Paul Getty, who was an oil billionaire. Both of them died worth about $2.5 billion, roughly. Hughes funded a bunch of philanthropic organizations that are actually philanthropic, and some of them still exist. Like, there's this thing, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, that is, I think it's the second best endowed private foundation in the country. And they fund all kinds of, they basically give grants to people to do research on things like immunology and genetics and things like, basic medical research. But J. Paul Getty didn't endow anything. He basically just bought a bunch of art. But one thing he did endow one person he did support was this Kenneth Anger, who was basically a student of Aleister Crowley. He was an occultist who created homoerotic occult movies with names like Lucifer Rising, and like this guy was in the same circle as the Rolling Stones and people like this. You start to see like this is the underbelly where maybe like someone like Jackson Pollock that's pretty light fare compared to some of this stuff where you start to get into literally Satanism and the occult and all this kind of stuff.
Can they popularize something occult and satanic like that?
You make the Rolling Stones sell it. Look at all of their sympathy for the devil and on Her Majesty's satanic service and all this
and
kind
all the
of
Lady
stuff.
Gaga stuff. By the way, I totally forgot when we were talking in the beginning of the episode about the foundations that the Rockefellers own. I totally forgot. Right near the MoMA in Midtown Manhattan, they also own the Population Council, the Population Reduction Council. Let's put a link to that map of all the buildings they own and their purpose in Manhattan, and you can easily see how they're all interconnected. I always come back to this being part of a larger plan to control the world population. I think that's what it always comes down to when you're talking about a specific type of elite like the Rockefellers.
How many teenagers who are calling themselves, we're Lady Gaga's little monsters, and yeah, I feel I'm different just like Lady Gaga, and no one understands me, and I don't like my parents. How many of those kids are then thinking about, man, you know what I'd really like to do? Have 5 kids.
Right. I felt that, like, when I was young, having a family was the last thing that I'd want to do. It seemed so unappealing because I identified as one of those types of people.
You think of it as something that stupid people do. Like, you're too stupid to be hip to this kind of stuff, and that's why you're out having a family. I think that's kind of what it boils down to.
It made me feel special. I wasn't one of those typical middle-class suckers that gets tied down. I needed the freedom to move around, even if I wasn't moving anywhere.
Yeah, and it's just, when people say, there are a lot of people out there covering...
Like I said, I thought I was so cool, and I was really just a tool of the CIA. I'm so self-reflective. And also, what they pushed on us runs deep. Don't think that I'm not vulnerable to this kind of stuff still. I don't even know if I want to go back to a traditional way of life.
And if the goal is population reduction, it's a lot easier to just finance some music festivals and some books and stuff than it is to try to, like, start a world war. There are more... what's the statistic? It's something like there are more single people over 30 than any time in U.S. history right now. We're not saying that that's like the end-all be-all of life, but it's kind of like to promote that's, none of these people are writing books or singing songs or whatever about their great family. And I think that's when we get back to, like, what is the duty of the artist? And I think you can see how influential this kind of stuff is on especially developing minds of young people.
Now we have Lady Gaga's Little Monsters, where her Twitter feed promotes more and more self-mutilation. The number one little monster is the one who has the most facial piercings and tattoos this month.
Yeah. Whereas, people our age, I'm not sure if Bill Cosby was my role model, but I remember sitting around watching The Cosby Show and just thinking, like, wow, what a great family and, like, what a great father figure. And, where is that? Now you get Modern Family, or you get, and it's, I think there you go. It's like, is progress defined by pushing the boundaries of decency, basically? I don't even want to say morality, or, you know what I mean, though?
Expanding the boundaries and expanding the boundaries and expanding the boundaries, I think, is what most modern artists believe their job is.
Of social propriety, or of, like, what's accepted in society.
You can't even advocate for a standard for what's healthy or sane without getting in big trouble because it's not politically correct.
I mean, in my mind, and I'm sure a lot of people out there will relate to this, life is hard. It's hard to make a living, especially now. It's hard to, it's just sort of hard to, like, feel hope for the future and feel like you've got some sense of positive direction. And it's just difficult, and you need inspiration in your life to sort of, like, stay focused on what you're trying to accomplish or what you're trying to build, or like, and I look at my kids and think like, what am I leaving to them in the long term, and is it worth it for me to like go and work for the next 20, 30 years, hoping that I can save enough for them to go to college, hoping that I can help them buy a first home, or anything like that. And it's just demoralizing to look out there at what happens in the popular culture and in movies. And then, every time a new movie comes out, it's like a sex comedy about swingers or about, you know what I mean, just this ridiculous crap. And then you just see like what's being promoted to teenagers and stuff. It's pretty bleak. And so it's like there is a vacuum into which real artists can step and inspire people towards something more, I don't know if I want to say wholesome, but you know what I mean, something more constructive in something that's about...
There is a vacuum, just like there's a vacuum in political activism that we're filling. But the question is, are they going to promote it and fund it and let it get through? It took a month or a few weeks to get 300,000 people out on the street for the climate march, which was funded by the same people who fund and promote modern artists. Like, how does a Jackson Pollock suddenly become a Jackson Pollock? Unless he's funded and promoted and mythologized by the big guys that use the big advertising houses. Somebody else could be an activist with the right program for 1,000 years. But I don't want to be that pessimistic about it, because I believe what's true and what's good wins in the end anyway. Somehow God makes it find a way. And this other stuff just becomes the joke of history, just like my friend the other day found a 1977 Time magazine cover that said, "Are you ready for the coming ice age?" And then he compared that to the cover of Time magazine that says, "Are you ready for global warming?" That was recent. They like to promote characters like Andy Warhol, and what's more decadent than that?
And if it's not, then, that person doesn't make it onto MTV and Saturday Night Live and
yeah, they use
maybe
censorship.
Even the radio waves. And yeah, it's just, the idea of like, I think even like I heard Michelle Obama saying that her daughters look up to Beyonce. What a disgusting thought. No offense to Beyonce. No offense, you're disgusting. But because she is a woman who her career is based on taking her clothes off and shaking her ass and singing about sexuality. That's your role model? Not all the great leaders of the civil rights movement, or not even like Oprah or something. Beyonce is your role model. I think it just goes to show you, though, that like how effective mass communication is. It works in the same way as like a religion does, which is people can't all sit in a room together and converse, so they have to like connect to something that they're all able to share. And that's going to end up being the things going over the airwaves and going over the TV screens, and
The quality of our popular entertainment means so much. It can move a culture in any direction it wants. It can effectively create a bunch of high-functioning, enlightened people, or a bunch of low-functioning, unenlightened, broken people.
Well, like, to take a modern example, maybe to remove it from the United States just so people can look at it more objectively, look again at Russia, where on the one hand you have a certain amount of state control, and people are so scared of this kind of stuff, but a certain amount of state-controlled media and a state relationship with the Orthodox Church. I think that constitutes sort of a life-affirming culture where it's about people are interested in things like nuclear power. They're interested in agriculture and technology and industry, and they haven't achieved all the things they want to do, but they're trying to create cultural touchstones that people can connect to and can feel like, yes, Russia's moving in the right direction. I'm sort of proud to be part of this thing. I believe in what we're doing. And then from the other end, people are trying to tear that down, whether it's Pussy Riot or Femin, who are these like topless protesters that think like the number one crime in the world is that Putin won't let bare-chested women run around the streets screaming. It's just crazy. If the CIA could literally hire a homeless guy to whack off in front of a McDonald's and call it art.
People get confused when they say it's CIA funded because they say, well, what does that mean? The CIA is connected to the government. And in my experience, the CIA is an organization that's outside of our government structure, used to do the bidding of the world's wealthiest, like people like the Rockefellers.
Yeah, we talked about art being like the art world being a money laundering organization. It's kind of the same way. It's just like they've got a black budget of however much money they want. It goes in there. We're not blaming the desk jockeys of the CIA. We're just saying that's where the money originates. But then it's the super rich are getting their dirty hands in there and getting grants and contracts and having certain strategic relationships to do these kinds of things. It's not like the CIA, meaning like the director of the CIA is coming up with all this policy. They are just a conduit for your tax dollars to be put to use in the service of finance oligarchs.
It's outside of the framework of what the average person understands to be the government. That's why a common slogan might be something like, the CIA killed Kennedy. You often hear the CIA launders the drug money, or the CIA runs the drugs into America. What do people mean when they say that? The CIA works for private interests, cooperates with British intelligence MI6 to serve the interests of the Queen. Then, as usual, we ask, what are the interests of the Queen? A few days after the climate march, the message quickly morphed into what it was always meant to be.
Was that girl?
Bindi Irwin?
Look, that's a CIA operation right there. To say, I sent a letter to Hillary Clinton and she said I couldn't express myself and I'm just Bindi Irwin and I want to save the animals. And this is a really, really radical thing to say. Nobody else could say it. It's coming from a kid, so you can't hate the kid because the kid just doesn't really... If you're really angry, then you could just say, oh, it's a kid. She didn't know what she was talking about.
And poor Bindi, her dad gets stung to death by a stingray, and who knows who's been whispering into her ear with all this crazy population reduction stuff. She's just the daughter of some zookeeper who went running around jumping on crocodiles.
What I'm saying is that this is the best example I've seen lately of a CIA operation. This was always the message from the beginning of the climate march. They just set it up with the climate march, and then here comes Bindi Irwin from stage left. The Rockefellers own the Center for Population. This is what it was always about. And if you think it wasn't planned that strategically and that much in advance and that carefully, you would be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, they were all involved in the early eugenics societies. People don't realize that even like the roots of Nazism come out of population reduction, come out of things like Planned Parenthood and...
the Rockefellers fund Planned Parenthood, too.
Right. But basically, like, eugenics was a much more overt thing in like, the teens and the 20s than it is now, and now it just is under different guises. But basically, the ideas of racial hygiene, you have to ask maybe some pretty uncomfortable questions about things like Ebola. Why is that striking Africa? And I know you talked with Webster about the poverty issue, but we have to ask about biowarfare. Mm-hmm. The U.S. has biowarfare laboratories. Is Ebola a naturally occurring virus?
We'll never know what is actually a bioweapon and what isn't, but they certainly have no problem with Africans dying, and the population made it irrelevant and non-threatening. We've got to finish this episode off with art being a cultural weapon that decreases the population.
Yeah, and it's one of many weapons to basically solidify the interests of finance oligarchs, which are a reduced, helpless population that does not have its own power through government protections. And that, going back to other shows we've done, whether that is through... you can't have a tariff to protect your factory, you can't have a fair price to protect your farm, or a living wage to protect your job. Or
imagine if in the 30s, instead of chiseling off Diego Rivera's mural, the Rockefellers had celebrated it.
Yeah.
and encouraged other artists to do similar work, exposing social evil.
Yeah.
Imagine if every public building had murals that showed the face of modern evil. Stockbrokers that look like mummies and ghouls. In that context, prove to me the social benefit of a Jackson Pollock.
Right, so maybe, we can continue this discussion. If anyone wants to chime in with ideas or questions or opinions, you can do that to unitedfrontradio@gmail.com. We'd love to hear what people have to say about this, and especially anybody who's got inside experience working in the culture industries and just sort of, what you've seen about how this works.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're an artist, Kyle. You're a professional graphic designer. Do you want to talk a little bit about that world?
There's a real filtering process that takes place, even in something like graphic design, where starting in art school, basically, there's no filtering in high school. They want people with the most talent, basically, and then from those people with talent, they find the people that are most subservient to the right teachers. Then they're pulled out for special assignments, and who knows what those are. And then you're filtered by the hiring process. Then you're filtered by the promotions process. And so by the time you get to the top, you're dealing. In graphic design, one of the most prestigious agencies is called Pentagram.
Jesus Christ!
And that, that's the agency that does work for all of the big, New York Fortune 500s. Or there's a very short list of people that are doing branding and advertising and whatever work, and when you boil it down, they are either, in my view, they're either occultists or they come from a background of military intelligence. You can see this in the ad industry. There's a big agency called Ogilvy and Mather that's one of the biggest ones. I think Leo Burnett might also have come from this kind of a background, but that this David Ogilvy was basically, was he an MI5 agent? Basically, he was a propaganda agent for either U.S. or British intelligence. And that's where a lot of these agencies come from. People have probably heard some of this dealing with, Edward Bernays and the invention of public relations and all this stuff for the same purpose. It's not just corporate, it's culture creation.
And this brings us right to the heart of the matter, which is that the British Empire realized a while ago they can't control the world with war and with their military. So they transitioned to controlling the world with ideas.
Absolutely. They externalized the British Empire into a series of corporate cartels and into Wall Street and London finance.
When people say British intelligence, does that really exist? That exists as much as a battleship exists.
Right.
That exists as much as a nuclear warhead. That exists as much as the Pentagon exists.
And maybe at this point you could maybe say Anglo-American or maybe Anglo-American-Israeli, or, you could come up with something bigger.
Right. The white Western world empire, Western imperialism. And how do you keep that? You got to control people's minds. You keep that with ideas.
Yeah, they think it's James Bond or something.
I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, they think it's James Bond, but I think they think that it's I don't know. I don't think they can wrap their head around it because you don't see the tanks. You don't see the battleships. People can go out on the street and protest no war, but and the idea of colonialism or, imperialism in that way, but they don't know how to get their heads around the imperialism of ideas.
Right. And so if you are fighting against an empire of ideas, you've got to fight back with ideas. We're not going to win by retreating to our bunkers and grabbing our storable food and our shotguns and stuff. We're going to fight back with
program,
with program, with intellect, but also I think with art. But you do need to inspire the program and inspire the intellect with art in the same way that they use art to fight against you. So, who's our Diego Rivera today? Who's our Schiller? Who's our Beethoven?
You've been listening to United Front Radio at ucy.tv/UFR. Have a blessed evening.
We're sitting down with Michael Scheuer, the man who had served in the CIA for more than 2 years, up until 2004. At one time, he was the chief of the CIA bin Laden unit. Then he went and exposed how counter-effective Washington's methods were in the fight against terror. He looked at the U.S. through its enemy's eyes. In fact, it's the title of one of his books called Through Our Enemy's Eyes. I'm very pleased to have the chance to interview you, Mr. Scheuer.
I'm glad to be here.
Bin Laden is gone. Who is Washington's number one enemy now?
Washington's enemy is an enemy that doesn't exist. We're fighting an Islamic enemy that Washington believes is out to kill us because we have elections, because we're free, because we have women in the workplace. It's an enemy that doesn't exist. It didn't exist when bin Laden was alive. It doesn't exist now. America is being attacked because of its foreign policy in the Muslim world, because of its support for Israel, because of its support for the Saudi police state, because of its presence on the Arab Peninsula. And until we accept that, until Americans can say to each other, whether you support aid to Israel or not, our relationship with Israel is causing this war, we are not going to be able to defeat this enemy. And Israel itself as a country is not the problem. The real problem is the leaders of the Jewish American community in the United States who influence and corrupt our Congress to support Israel when we have no interest there.
You imply that the Israeli lobby is dragging the United States into the wars, into the conflicts?
They're absolutely dragging us in.
Yeah, are you surprised the CIA estimate is now 15 to 30,000, maybe 31,000 ISIS fighters?
I think a lot of the time they're just grabbing numbers out of the air. I think that's one of the reasons we see those numbers jump around so much. But it could be 30,000. Tomorrow it could be 15,000. I think the question here is not about a permanent army of 30,000 troops. It's about people who are attracted, who may become disillusioned, who may leave. It depends very much what's going on the battlefield, and to some extent even what's going on in social media. I think, we are seeing, for instance, now some British jihadis who are with ISIS who are saying they want to go back to England, but they're afraid that if they go back, they'll be prosecuted. So I think it's going to be a very fluid kind of situation.
Well, what do you think, Philip Mudd, because you've studied this as well. What I've heard is that they're recruiting left Sunnis, disgruntled Sunnis who hate the Shiite regime in Baghdad, and they're getting these numbers in part because they have a lot of money.
Sure, but we're confusing two questions here, Wolf, and I think the president confused them a bit last night. That is the question of how many people, some disaffected, for example, Iraqi army veteran, how many people are in the trenches in Iraq trying to unseat the regime in places like Anbar province, and how many people, for example, a recruit from New York or Washington, D.C., are in the small sliver of ISIS who might direct terrorism operations against Europe and the United States. Sure, maybe there's 30,000 people in ISIS. The vast majority of them have nothing to do with plotting against the United States. The president talked about a counterinsurgency campaign against ISIS in Iraq, but that has nothing to do with threats to Washington, D.C., and I think we ought to separate out those two questions of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism.